There are stories that history celebrates, and then there are stories it hides. What you are about to hear was not erased because no one knew. It was buried because too many people knew, and what they knew was disturbing. In the polished books of Southern history, plantations are often softened. They are described as homes, as legacies, as traditions. But behind those clean words lived systems of power that operated without limits. Power over bodies, power over bloodlines, power over silence. This story survived in fragments, in whispers, in broken records, in questions no one wanted to ask. In 1847, in Georgia, one plantation hid a secret so deeply woven into family and profit that exposing it would have shattered everything people believed about morality, motherhood, and control. This was not a crime committed in the shadows. It was a system operating in plain sight. The uncomfortable truth is this: some histories are hidden not because they are rare, but because they are common. They threaten the image people worked hard to protect. What you will learn in this video is not just about one woman. It is about how absolute power reshapes conscience, how money rewrites morality, and how silence becomes the most effective tool of all. You will learn how wealth created immunity, how family loyalty became a shield, how the law looked away while cruelty dressed itself as order. You will learn why official records suddenly go quiet, why names disappear, why entire lives are reduced to numbers and margins, and most importantly, you will understand why these stories still matter now. Because when history is softened, the same patterns repeat, different names, different places, same structure. This is not a story meant to shock you for entertainment. It is meant to sharpen your awareness, to remind you that power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it speaks softly, sometimes it wears respectability, sometimes it hides behind tradition. As you listen, notice what feels unsettling. That discomfort is not accidental. It is the signal that you are touching a truth long avoided. By the end of this video, you will not just know what happened. You will understand why it was allowed to happen, and why generations worked so hard to make sure you never heard about it. Stay with this story until the end, because the most important part is not the secret itself. It is the silence that protected it. Before we talk about the secret itself, we have to understand the world that protected it. Georgia in the mid-1800s was not just a place. It was a system, a carefully built structure designed to concentrate power in the hands of a few families and keep it there for generations. Plantations were not small farms. They were massive economic engines. Thousands of acres, dozens, sometimes hundreds of enslaved people, one family at the top, everyone else beneath them. Before we talk about the people involved, it matters to see how wealth worked. Land meant money, crops meant influence, and enslaved bodies meant both. The more land a family controlled, the more labor they could force. The more labor they controlled, the richer and more untouchable they became. Wealth did not spread outward, it stacked upward. A small circle of families owned most of the land, most of the people, and most of the power. Before we talk about morality, we need to understand control. On these plantations, authority was absolute. The owner decided what work was done, who lived where, who married, and who was punished. There was no higher appeal. Local law enforcement often belonged to the same families or depended on them financially. Judges, ministers, and merchants were tied into the same network. Power was not checked. It was shared. Before we talk about secrecy, we have to talk about distance. Many plantations were isolated by design, miles from towns, roads that led only to the main house. Few visitors, fewer witnesses. This isolation created a private world with its own rules. What happened on the plantation stayed on the plantation. News traveled slowly. Questions were discouraged. Outsiders were unwelcome. Before we talk about dynasties, it is important to see how family shaped everything. Plantations were inherited, not earned. Sons were raised to expect ownership. Daughters were raised to protect the family name. Marriage was strategic. Reputation was currency. Anything that threatened the image of respectability was handled quietly, internally, and without record. Before we talk about silence, we need to understand fear. Enslaved people could not speak without punishment. Overseers followed orders or lost their positions. Neighbors minded their business because exposure could bring retaliation. Silence was not passive. It was enforced. It was rewarded. In this environment, secrets did not struggle to survive. They were protected by distance, wealth and shared interest. A plantation could function like a sealed container. Generations passed, faces changed, but the structure stayed the same. And inside that structure, actions that would have caused outrage elsewhere became routine, unchallenged, and invisible to the outside world. This was the Georgia that existed in 1847, a place where power did not need to hide. It only needed to remain unspoken. Before we talk about the woman at the center of this story, we have to understand how plantation women were seen. In the public eye, they were presented as symbols of refinement, well-dressed, soft-spoken, educated enough to read scripture and manage a household. They were praised for grace, restraint, and moral strength. Society placed them on a pedestal, not because they were powerless, but because they appeared harmless. Before we talk about authority, we need to look at reputation. Plantation mistresses were expected to embody virtue. Church attendance was visible. Charity was performative. Manners were carefully maintained. Their role was to project stability and righteousness. This image mattered. It reassured neighbors. It softened the brutality of the system they lived inside. It suggested order where there was violence. Before we talk about religion, it is important to see how faith was used. Many plantation women were deeply involved in religious life. They hosted prayers. They taught hymns. They spoke the language of morality fluently. Religion became proof of character. No one questioned a woman who quoted scripture. No one suspected cruelty behind a Bible held in public. Before we talk about power, we must understand access. While men often handled contracts and crops, women controlled the domestic world. They managed food, clothing, and living conditions. They decided work assignments inside the house. They supervised punishment. They kept records. This was not passive influence. It was daily, direct authority over human lives. Before we talk about silence, notice how gender worked as a shield. A white woman was assumed to be nurturing, protective, innocent. That assumption created cover. Accusations against them felt unthinkable. Who would believe that a refined mistress could be cruel? Who would question a woman praised for morality? Before we talk about appearances, it matters to see how carefully they were maintained. Letters were polite. Visitors were guided. Public interactions were controlled. Anything that could threaten the image of gentility was handled behind closed doors. Privacy was not just comfort. It was strategy. Before we talk about private behavior, understand that isolation magnified authority. On distant plantations, the mistress often ruled without oversight. Husbands traveled. Some studied or managed distant land. Overseers answered to her. Enslaved women answered to her. In these spaces, the line between household management and absolute power disappeared. The public saw refinement. They saw prayer. They saw order. What they did not see was how that image allowed unchecked control to operate quietly. In a world that trusted appearances, a woman who looked moral could do almost anything without being questioned. Before we talk about individual actions, we have to understand the law that made those actions possible. In Georgia during the mid-1800s, enslaved people were not recognized as human beings under the legal system. They were classified as property, the same category as land, livestock, or equipment. This was not symbolic. It was written into law and enforced every day. Before we talk about violence, we need to understand ownership. If a person is legally property, their body does not belong to them. Their labor does not belong to them. Their children do not belong to them. Every part of their existence was controlled by someone else. Consent did not exist. Refusal was treated as disobedience. Resistance was punished as damage to property. Before we talk about autonomy, we must look at what the law removed. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in court. They could not file complaints. They could not legally marry. They could not claim parenthood over their own children. Their bodies were governed by the will of the owner. This meant that abuse was not seen as a crime. It was seen as a private matter. Before we talk about records, it is important to see how the legal system defined harm. Courts were designed to protect property owners, not the enslaved. If violence reduced a person's ability to work, it mattered. If it did not, it often went unnoticed. Sexual abuse left no legal damage unless it disrupted productivity or inheritance. Even then, the concern was financial, not moral. Before we talk about documentation, understand how paperwork worked. Births of enslaved children were recorded as increases in inventory. Names were optional. Fathers were rarely listed. Causes of injury or trauma were not required. Pain did not have a column. Fear did not have a line. The system was not built to capture suffering. Before we talk about silence, recognize how reporting abuse threatened wealth. Acknowledging wrongdoing meant admitting liability. It meant questioning ownership itself, so records were vague, language was softened, details were omitted. What could not be justified was simply not written down. Before we talk about accountability, we must face the reality that the law protected the abuser. Plantation owners were rarely investigated. Plantation women were almost never questioned. Overseers followed orders and avoided blame. Everyone involved had incentive to look away. The legal system rewarded silence and punished exposure. Before we talk about why these stories are hard to trace today, remember this: absence of evidence does not mean absence of harm. It means the system was designed to erase it. Abuse rarely appears in official records, not because it was rare, but because the law never intended to see it. Before we talk about the acts themselves, we need to understand who the sons were raised to become. On Georgia plantations, white sons were not taught to question authority. They were taught to inherit it. From childhood, they were surrounded by signs of dominance. People moved when they entered a room. Orders were obeyed without discussion. This environment shaped identity long before adulthood. Before we talk about behavior, it matters to see how entitlement was learned. Boys watched their fathers give commands and receive compliance. They saw punishment delivered without consequence. They saw bodies treated as tools. These lessons were not explained in words. They were absorbed through daily life. Power became normal. Control felt natural. Before we talk about morality, we have to understand education. Sons were taught manners, religion and leadership, but rarely restraint. They learned how to manage land, not how to respect people. Right and wrong were framed around property and reputation, not harm. As long as the plantation functioned and the family name remained intact, behavior went unchallenged. Before we talk about boundaries, notice what was missing. There were no real limits placed on these young men. Enslaved people could not refuse them. Overseers did not discipline them. Mothers often protected them. Fathers excused them. When no one can say no, desire turns into expectation. Before we talk about accountability, it is important to understand immunity. White sons were shielded from consequences by the system itself. If harm occurred, it was handled privately. If a boundary was crossed, it was reframed as a mistake or ignored entirely. The law did not intervene. Society did not interfere. Before we talk about violence, we must look at how control was tested. Adolescence became a time to experiment with authority, ordering punishments, demanding labor, taking what was wanted. Each unchecked action reinforced the belief that power had no cost. The absence of resistance became confirmation. Before we talk about family dynamics, understand that sons were investments. They represented the future of the estate. Protecting them mattered more than protecting anyone else. Their behavior reflected on the family, so problems were buried, not corrected. Discipline was seen as weakness. Silence was seen as loyalty. Before we talk about ethics, we need to see how ownership erased them. When people are legally property, moral boundaries collapse. Desire is not restrained by consent. Curiosity is not checked by empathy. The system taught one lesson clearly: if you own something, you can use it. In this environment, sons grew into men without learning limits. Power was inherited alongside land, and when control is taught early and never questioned, cruelty does not feel like cruelty, it feels like privilege. Before we talk about individual cruelty, we have to understand the economics that rewarded it. On Georgia plantations, enslaved people were not only labor, they were assets. Their value could be measured, increased and inherited. One of the most reliable ways to grow that value was through birth. Before we talk about children, we need to talk about money. By the mid-1800s, the domestic slave trade was booming. Laws restricting international importation made enslaved births inside the country more valuable. Every child born enslaved represented future labor and future profit. From the moment of birth, that child was counted as property, added to ledgers, and calculated into the estate's worth. Before we talk about reproduction, it is important to see how deliberately it was treated. Births were not accidental in this system, they were anticipated, sometimes encouraged, sometimes engineered. Enslaved women were pressured to have children. Their value increased if they did. Men were paired or reassigned based on physical strength or productivity. Language like healthy stock was common. This was not family life, it was management. Before we talk about choice, we must be clear about coercion. Enslaved women did not control when or with whom they became pregnant. Refusal was rarely an option. Punishment, threats or forced compliance followed resistance. Even when violence was not overt, the imbalance of power made consent impossible. The system functioned because it did not need agreement, it only needed obedience. Before we talk about incentives, notice how plantation owners framed it. They often claimed they were encouraging natural growth. That phrase masked reality. Food rations, reduced labor during pregnancy, or small privileges were offered, not as care, but as investment. A woman who produced more children was seen as more valuable. Her suffering was irrelevant to the calculation. Before we talk about morality, we need to understand how profit erased it. These practices were discussed in financial terms, not ethical ones. Estate planning included projected births. Inheritance documents listed children alongside livestock. The future of the plantation depended on reproduction continuing without interruption. Before we talk about normalization, recognize how common this became. Because it was legal, it was discussed openly in private circles. Neighbors shared strategies. Families compared numbers. There was no shame inside the system. The only concern was efficiency. Before we talk about records, remember how this appeared on paper. Births were logged without context. No mention of coercion. No mention of violence. Just numbers increasing. From the outside it looked like growth. From the inside it was forced continuation of control. In this economy, bodies became balance sheets, childhood became inventory, and reproduction was no longer human. It was a business strategy that rewarded silence and multiplied wealth. Before we talk about the allegation itself, we have to understand how power can bend reality. On a plantation, authority did not stop at ownership of land or labor. It extended into family bodies and secrecy. When one person controlled reputation, money, and silence, even the most disturbing acts could be absorbed into the system without resistance. Before we talk about the sons, it is important to understand how they were positioned. They were not just children, they were heirs. Their futures mattered more than truth. Protecting them meant protecting the estate. Protecting the estate meant protecting the woman who managed it. Loyalty inside the family was absolute, even when morality collapsed. Before we talk about the woman, we must understand how her authority worked. As the plantation mistress, she controlled the domestic world. She decided who worked where, who entered the house, who was sent away. She managed privacy. She managed distance. This control allowed her to shape circumstances without leaving fingerprints. Before we talk about abuse, we need to understand how enslaved women became a shield. Any pregnancy involving a white man could be explained away. No one asked questions. Enslaved women had no legal voice. Their bodies were already controlled. Their children were already property. This made them the perfect cover. Biological lines could be crossed while appearing socially acceptable within the system. Before we talk about incest, it is crucial to see how the system disguised it. If a child was born enslaved, no one demanded the father's name. If the father was white, silence followed. If the bloodline connected back to the household, it remained invisible. The law did not investigate. Society did not challenge. The structure absorbed the violation. Before we talk about accountability, notice who benefited from silence. The sons avoided scandal. The estate avoided legal risk. The woman maintained her public image. Everyone with power gained from ignoring the truth. Those without power carried the consequences. Before we talk about records, understand why nothing appears clearly written. No confessions. No trials. There's no direct accusations. That absence is not proof of innocence. It is proof of control. When the same person controls the household, the paperwork, and the narrative, truth does not survive intact. Before we talk about belief, recognize how unthinkable accusations were against a refined woman. Society did not have language for female authority used this way. Suspicion alone felt offensive. Doubt was dismissed as gossip. Questioning her meant questioning the entire structure that supported her. Before we talk about legacy, understand this power does not need permission to abuse. It only needs protection. In this world, protection came through law, silence, and ownership. And when those three aligned, accountability vanished completely. Before we talk about the children born into this system, we have to understand the position of the women first. Enslaved women lived at the intersection of ownership and vulnerability. They were expected to work, obey, and endure, all while having no control over their own bodies. Their existence was defined by what others demanded of them. Before we talk about violence, it is important to see how constant the threat was. Enslaved women faced physical punishment, sexual coercion, and emotional terror as part of daily life. There was no clear line between labor and abuse. A command could become an assault. Resistance could become violence. Survival often meant silence. Before we talk about choice, we must be honest about power. Consent cannot exist where refusal is punished. Enslaved women could not say no without consequence. Their bodies were legally owned. Their pain had no legal weight. What happened to them was rarely questioned, and never centered on their humanity. Before we talk about reproduction, we need to understand how it was forced into their lives. Pregnancy was not always the result of personal relationships. It was often the result of coercion or direct assault. Some women were pressured to conceive. Others were targeted repeatedly. Their ability to bear children became another way they were exploited. Before we talk about motherhood, recognize the cruelty of the situation. Enslaved women gave birth, knowing their children would not belong to them. A child could be taken, sold, punished, used. The bond between mother and child existed emotionally, but not legally. That separation was a form of control that cut deeply and repeatedly. Before we talk about identity, we must look at what their children represented. These children carried blood ties to the enslavers, sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden. Yet those ties offered no protection. A child could resemble the household that owned them, and still be listed as property. Biology did not override ownership. Before we talk about silence, understand how dangerous truth was. Speaking about abuse risked punishment. Speaking about parentage risked violence. Even acknowledgement could lead to separation or death. So stories stayed unspoken. Pain stayed internal. Memory was carried quietly. Before we talk about records, remember how these lives appeared on paper. Births were logged without context. Fathers unnamed. Mothers reduced to numbers. No mention of fear. No mention of coercion. The system recorded value, not suffering. Before we talk about legacy, understand that these women were trapped in a structure designed to use them and erase them at the same time. They carried the weight of violence, reproduction, and silence. Befactituals, wiskakulas wajakulas wastrol bekamsi, and through them, the system reproduced itself, generation after generation, without ever having to answer for the harm it caused. Even though official records often remain silent, fragments of this hidden history survived in letters, diaries, and oral accounts passed down quietly through generations. These pieces rarely tell the full story, and they never offer direct confessions. Yet they reveal patterns of control, abuse, and survival that speak louder than any official document ever could. Modern historians carefully piece these fragments together, connecting the dots to reconstruct a picture of a world that those in power tried to erase. In fact, the very absence of records is itself evidence, proof of the lengths to which the system went to hide the truth. If this story opened your eyes to a part of history rarely discussed, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are more hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. and you don't want to miss them.